Hello, nobility of the Butler universe. Nathan P. Butler here. Of course, right? You're watching this through the Patreon, so of course it's me. This is our exclusive Q&A for the month of July 2018. After a little while of not having new questions, we now have one that came in, sort of a question/message, kind of like we saw with Chris Locke. This one coming in from David Ray about some somewhat controversial recent issues in the Star Wars fan community. Remember, if you want to ask a question for the next exclusive Q&A, just go to the Patreon. Again, patreon.com/NathanPButler, where you're watching this. Go down through the current posts, and there should be one that is a collection thread, a Q&A collection thread for July 2018. Put your question in there as a comment. I'll grab it in early August and use that for a new Q&A. I did also come up with sort of a list of generic questions, things I've been asked before frequently, but that maybe haven't been asked on here or asked recently, that I've sort of set aside as a potential set of subjects for months where we don't actually have any questions getting asked. So we shouldn't, hopefully, have any more months without an exclusive Q&A video, because at least I'll have those backup questions as well. Okay, that said, the question this time, or the comment this time, comes from David Ray, and I'm going to try to kind of take this in a couple of pieces rather than all as one whole first, if that's okay here. So David says, "Hi, Nate. I have a question and a little rant." That, by the way, is where I'm going to do the split, so we can look at the question first and then the rant afterwards, because they each have different areas that are worth exploring. "My question involves Rebel Force Radio and recent controversy with them and content creators, and the Kelly Marie Tran stuff with her leaving Instagram because she was being bullied by asshats. For those that don't know, Chuck Wendig called out fans that were being assholes, and Rebel Force Radio had to put their 2 cents into it and said content creators shouldn't give their opinions about fans, and Disney should basically do what DC does, which is prevent content creators from talking about their opinions to the fan base. Because for DC Comics, content creators can only talk about, "Oh, I'm making this," or "It was such a wonderful experience working on Justice League." And that's it. They can't talk about their opinions on stuff. They can't defend their work to fans or anything like that. So that's what Rebel Force Radio said Lucasfilm should do, which I think is BS. Alright, so this is where I want to sort of jump in here. I think that there is kind of a difference out there in terms of content creation that a lot of times is a line that doesn't get drawn, or a distinction that doesn't get made. Because when it comes to content creators, whether it's Marvel or DC or Del Rey, Lucasfilm, Disney, wherever, content creators come in different stripes. You've got what amounts to sort of the ongoing employees, who are the people that actually work for the company throughout, maybe on this project, maybe on something else, but they are with the company throughout. And then you've got what's sort of a work for hire or a work by project type of thing, where someone isn't actually a full-time employee of that particular company and is specifically brought in to work on one project or a set of projects and then is gone. Sort of freelance work, essentially, where basically you get a chance to write for something and then you step away. And a lot of times when we look at issues like this, there are those distinctions without a difference, but this isn't one of those. There's a distinction with a very clear, very important difference. When you're looking at something like a DC Comics, a Marvel Comics, a lot of times the big comic companies have ongoing people working for them. People who are there as sort of the full-time thing. They are Marvel content creators, Marvel writers, Marvel artists, whatever. They have an exclusive contract usually, but they are working with Marvel, and Marvel just assigns them to different projects and whatnot. But they're not freelance by any means. They are Marvel employees. When you look at someone like Lucasfilm, you've got Pablo Hidalgo, Leland Chee, Andy Gutierrez, lots of different people related to the situation at Lucasfilm in different capacities, whether it's writing, story group, directing, etc., etc. But some of them, like those people, are your full-time employees. They are there. They are tied to that company. Therefore, we would assume that they have sort of a, you might say, a duty to represent the company well, to represent the brand well, because that is their current employer. Just like me, right? I'm not going to go out and rail and go all crazy when it comes to, I don't know, maybe it's an educational topic or something. Maybe it's going off on a school that really screwed us over this summer and screwed over their students really badly this summer. I'm not going to go and rant about that. Why? Because that is my employer in an ongoing basis, or on an ongoing basis, and I should treat that with respect, essentially, right? And in those cases, yes, an employer could, they haven't in my case, but they could say, okay, as part of your employment, we don't want you to do X, Y, Z. We don't want you to reach out in this case. We don't want you to do this. It's kind of like what happened when, Disney came in and took over Lucasfilm, and all of a sudden, the line of communication between me and Leland Chee pretty much slammed shut. Like, we had this ongoing line of communication where I could just email him with questions. He would email me sometimes to say, hey, what do you think of this? Like when they were putting together the dates for the timeline videos for the Old Republic, and he sent me sort of a snapshot of what they were going to do to sort of give it a once-over and that sort of thing, which I was honored to do. That door slammed shut because Disney wanted them to take a different approach to relations with fans. And eventually, Leland had less of an ongoing online presence answering questions from fans than, say, Pablo Hidalgo does, or even Matt Martin does, who are both members of the story group alongside Leland Chee. But that's all stuff that you can do that can be laid out for you because you are an employee at the time. Even then, though, there are lines that need to be drawn, right, between what you do in the professional sense and what you do in the personal sense. I think Pablo Hidalgo has been hit the hardest by this, probably, when it comes to Star Wars, because people are asking him questions about Star Wars frequently on his personal, not his work, his personal Twitter account. And he's answering them. And in doing so, it's opened up the door for a lot of people to ask questions and follow him and stuff, not because they know him as a person, but because they're interested in Star Wars. So they're having these ongoing conversations. Sometimes they get heated. Sometimes things get ugly. Back and forth between Pablo Hidalgo and other fans on a personal Twitter account, not his work account. Okay? Something that has nothing to do with Lucasfilm itself, other than the fact that he happens to work there, but it's on his personal time. And it blurs that line between, okay, wait a second, if he says something on there that pisses people off, or if he says something on there that is his opinion, that may not be the opinion, the disclaimer, right, may not necessarily be the opinion of Lucasfilm Limited, blah, blah, blah. If he says something that is offensive, does that reflect on Lucasfilm? Not just because he works there, but in his capacity as that employee, being someone answering Star Wars questions on his personal Twitter, even though he is someone who works there on an ongoing basis. And could they control that? Legally, don't really think they can control anything on his personal account, but they can control on a professional account. And in a personal account way, they could still have something like a morals clause in the contract that basically says, look, if you do something that is heavily immoral, heavily scandalous or whatever, we have the right to disassociate ourselves with you because we don't want that to reflect on us, even if you didn't do it in a professional capacity. Okay? But that's for full-time employees. But the people that do these, right, the people that write the books, write the comics and such, people who are in situations like me where you get invited, you come in, you write a comic, that's it. The people that write this kind of stuff, for the most part, are not ongoing employees, at least not of Lucasfilm. For the comics, some are ongoing employees of Marvel, some were for Dark Horse, for instance. But for the most part, with the books and with the movies, at least in terms of the actors and actresses involved, and often the writers that are involved, depending on the situation, and directors that are involved, these are not people who are ongoing employees of Lucasfilm. They come in, they do a job, they leave. Okay? That's it. While they are working for Lucasfilm, yes, they are bound by whatever contractual agreements there are that they make. And if any of those have like a non-disclosure agreement or something like that, they may have signed that is supposed to affect after they are no longer employed, then that can still take effect. But generally, you're not going to see that. Instead, it's you come in, act professionally, now you're on your own, say whatever you want, do whatever you want. One of the things that was going on back when I wrote for Star Wars Tales was the fact that Dark Horse couldn't get an issue out to save their lives, and they couldn't seem to get a comic out without errors in it. Usually things that a spell checker wouldn't catch, but that a human should, like B for buy and stuff like that, where a spell checker would still say it's a real word, but a human would say, wait a second, that's supposed to be B, not buy, or whatever. I had sort of gotten to the point where I was sort of, as it was referred to at the time, the voice of the loyal opposition. Someone who loved Star Wars very much, but was opposed to a lot of the things going on at the time that we saw were problems, and were pointing out those problems and ripping into those problems specifically because of that loyalty and love for it and wanting to uplift all of it. Again, the loyal opposition. Like the If the Republicans are in power, it's the Democrats who love the country and still want to uplift it, but are opposing what the Republicans are doing because they don't agree with it. But it's all still out of patriotism, or vice versa during a Democratic administration. Same kind of thing. And I asked Jeremy Barlow, when he asked me to write for Star Wars Tales, if I'd be interested in submitting a pitch and all that kind of stuff, one of the first things I asked was, how does this affect my Star Wars timeline? How does this affect my podcasting? Because at that point, I've been podcasting for about 2 years. I've been doing the timeline for about 7, I guess, maybe by that point. And he was very, very clear on this, which is, this is a work-for-hire kind of thing. You come in, you do the job, you're done. It has no impact on whether you can speak out as a fan, speak out as a critic, or anything like that otherwise, right? So I've had a chance to work on Tales, had action figures based off the the characters from it, had a chance to assist on the Atlas and that sort of thing. At no point has that ever curtailed what kind of opinions I could give, what kind of reviews I could do, what kind of criticism I could give, because it's a work-for-hire, you work on the project, you're done sort of thing. So a person like Chuck Wendig, who has done several things recently for Star Wars, he comes in, he does the job, he goes. That's it, right? He's not an ongoing employee. So unless there is some type of non-disclosure agreement or something they signed to begin with, and that is kind of pushing the bounds, because usually non-disclosure is non-disclosure of something that could be a legal entanglement or could be revealing trade secrets or something. They usually wouldn't do something like that. So when Chuck Wendig is out there spouting off, and sometimes he spouts off and I agree with him, sometimes he spouts off and he's a dick, just kind of depends on the day, on the issue du jour. I tend to think of Chuck Wendig kind of like people used to think of Donald Trump, which is that there's sort of the guy. If you meet him in person, he's very personable, but then there's the online persona that he takes, which is the same guy who was out there not pulling back when his fans were like, oh yeah, well you don't like Aftermath because you're a homophobe because of Sinjir, etc., etc. But he has every right to defend his work. He has every right to go out there and speak out. He could speak out against the films. He could bitch all he wants, fight with the fans all he wants, get into a big flame war, whatever, right? And I noticed that the colors are like, ooh, for some reason. He could basically say what he likes, right? That is his prerogative because he's not under a restriction as an ongoing employee might be. That said, again, we talk about the idea of freedom of speech and whatnot. You know, that freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequence of speech. It just means the government can't curtail your freedom of speech. Even private companies can, like a non-disclosure agreement kind of thing. But in that sense, you know, maybe he goes out and makes an ass of himself. Maybe he goes out and says something racist or whatever, right? And maybe Lucasfilm says, whoa, we want nothing to do with this guy ever again. And they just don't invite him back. Yeah, there can be that kind of consequence where they just don't invite him back. But that doesn't equate to, hey, shut up because you were involved officially. You're not allowed to have an opinion. There are different legal requirements to that sort of thing. And to say basically that by virtue of you participating in an official capacity, you are no longer ever allowed to have an opinion is asinine. That said, they're welcome to hold that opinion at Rebel Force Radio. It's just not in keeping with the legal realities of it, but they are more than welcome to say they don't think someone should do that, or to say they think that Lucasfilm should take a hiring and a control of speech approach like what DC does. More than welcome to say it. I don't agree. I don't think most people would agree. Legal scholars wouldn't agree, but they're welcome to hold the opinion. Again, goes back to the whole free speech thing. The second part of what David says is, now for my little rant. I used to listen to Rebel Force Radio back in the day when they were actually part of the Forcecast, but I haven't listened to them in a while because they became nothing more than a bunch of, oh, let's see how much money we can get out of Star Wars type of people and pandering to what I would consider the alt-right. I can say as a longtime Star Wars fan that I listened to you from the days of Republic Forces Radio Network. You guys at the Star Wars Report know way more about Star Wars than those guys ever did. Now, to the toxic fans in fandom. I listened to your podcast about toxic fans. He's talking about episodes, I think it was 235 and 234 of Star Wars Beyond the Films. And I came to the conclusion that Alt Legends has jumped in bed with the alt-right. If you don't already know, the Alt Legends group posted that they were behind the organized attacks on Kelly Marie Tran and the bot attack on The Last Jedi on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, I take what they say with a lot of salt, because they're like ISIS, and claim any and all attacks on Lucasfilm and Disney. But it does show that this group is just an alt-right group that is using Star Wars to push their own political agenda, which is discrimination, racism, and bias. They are not and never were fans, but a group that jumped on Star Wars because it's the hottest thing on the planet. I feel that we, the true Star Wars fans, need to call out their BS. Anyway, that's all I have for this one. Have a great day, and congratulations once again on becoming a dad. Well, thank you very much. We are getting closer and closer as we speak. Now dealing with sort of the third trimester kind of stuff, which is always an interesting shift from what I understand. First time for us, so can't really speak from personal experience on whether it's always an interesting new experience. A couple of things I would note here. One, we should probably, I guess, sort of clarify what's meant by alt-legends versus alt-right. Okay, in politics, the alt-right, or the alternative right, is this idea that essentially in politics you have the political left, which leans Democratic, capital L liberal, and then you have the conservative right, or the political right, which leans conservative, usually capital C conservative, Republican, with libertarians, capital L libertarians, kind of agreeing with either side depending on the issue. I tend to be sort of little L libertarian, kind of agreeing with either side depending on the issue. So I'm kind of caught in the middle, and half the time agreeing with Democrats, half with Republicans, and most of the time thinking that they're all crazy. But the idea is that on the right, I guess from you guys' perspective, yeah, this is the right over here. It's my hands going off to my left, so it got confusing for a second. That on the right, you've got just the regular right, which are just conservatives, right? Small government, low taxes, low taxation in general, usually anti-abortion, usually pro-death penalty, usually for personal freedoms in most respects, but not necessarily in all the same respects, usually for equality of opportunity, not of outcome, et cetera, right? So there's the political right, which is just kind of like the conservative wing of politics. And then you have the alt-right, which is also on the right, but which is sort of the alternative to the mainstream right. And these are the people that go off the deep end. These are the extreme, place where you'll hear the extreme racism, the bigotry, the extreme sort of the opposite of the extreme on the left, which is the extreme social justice warrior side of the left, right? Sort of the diametric opposite of that. And this would include groups like white supremacist groups, because oftentimes the alt-right is identified with white supremacy because, generally speaking, the racism and sexism that comes from it is anti anybody who's not white or anti anybody who's not male and such. So the alt-right carries with it this connotation of the racism and such that comes with it, the bigotry that comes with it. Alt-legends wasn't really designed to mean alt-right Legends fans. When I coined the term alt-legends back on Star Wars Beyond the Films, what, a year or two ago, that wasn't even remotely what was meant. It was drawing a parallel that in politics you have the right and the alt-right. And at the time that the term was coined, we had this issue going on where the political left was tending to basically try to paint all of the right with the alt-right brush. Oh, you happen to be Republican, you must agree with this white supremacist. Why? Because it's all the right. Or you voted for, I don't know, a Republican governor. Same thing, etc., etc. Oh, you want lower taxes? Does that make you a conservative? Conservative means right, means alt-right. Because you want low taxes, you're a racist. And just kind of taking the idea of you could sort of lump everybody together. And there was a distinct thing going on at the time in political discussion, which was that the right absolutely needed to forcefully, clearly, and unequivocally distance themselves from the alt-right. To be able to say, just because you are on the political right, conservative, Republican, whatever, does not make you a member of the alt-right. And in fact, you find the alt-right just as abhorrent as the left does. In fact, perhaps more so because they're hijacking your political wing of the political discussion, right? And it was just this idea that the right must unequivocally separate itself and distance itself and draw a distinction between itself and the alt-right. And that's all that the alt Legends thing was meant to be. It was this idea that you have regular people who want to see Legends continue, who are fans of the Legends continuity, maybe fans of that and the new continuity, maybe not. But people out there who would love to see Legends continue and would certainly like to convince Lucasfilm to do so, or Del Rey or Marvel or whoever to do so. But that's a distinct group of people that is different than the people out there who are essentially so anti-Disney, so anti-canon, anti-story group, so pro-Legends, that they're doing things like trying to spoil movies for people, that they are harassing people online, that they are issuing threats of physical violence. Like in my case, I'm a Star Wars fan who happened to have come out and said, you know what, it's a fictional saga. Lots of fictional sagas have multiple timelines. You are welcome to enjoy Legends and canon and Infinities and stuff like that if you want. Just enjoy what you're going to enjoy. It's not a crime against fandom to like the new stuff and the old stuff, or even just the new stuff if you're someone who doesn't like Legends. I got threats of physical violence from that, one of which sort of bordered on death threat. It's asinine, but that's the extreme. That's the nut jobs. And in any area of life, find a spectrum, and somewhere on the extreme, on one end or the other of the spectrum, probably both, there are nut jobs. So in essence, the idea was that Legends fans, like the right in America, needed to distance themselves from their fringe radical groups that didn't actually truly represent all of them, the same way that the political right needed to do so from the alt-right, which meant that the Legends group that was on the extreme, the Legends group that was not what regular Legends fans should want to associate themselves with, got the term alt-Legends. Not because of racism or bigotry, but because there needed to be a distinction between the two, and just as the right needed to basically say, we are not alt-right, screw those guys, Legends fans needed to say, we are not alt-Legends, screw those guys. What's happened, though, is that we have started to see sort of the alt-right linkage, where as the societal debate that goes on around us between left and right is tending to be more and more polarized over time, the extremes on either side coming out, that you start to see people who I do agree are alt-right and use Star Wars as a battleground for the culture war type conflict that's going on, who sort of hijack Star Wars and use it for that purpose. Or they are Star Wars fans who are alt-right and jump into it from that perspective. But just to say that anyone who is alt-Legends is associated with the alt-right would not be correct. There are plenty of people out there who are alt-Legends who are probably very, very liberal in their politics, right? Who are people who are out there who are very anti-Disney, but very pro, I don't know, gay rights, or they wanted to see Hillary win, or whatever, right? And people who are on the alt-right certainly would not have agreed with either of those positions, and yet could still be people who are ripping into Disney. The fact that a lot of the political rhetoric around Star Wars does come down, though, to the fact that Disney is taking a fairly pro-diversity stand, which tends to be left-leaning, and that Hollywood in general tends to lean left politically, does mean that a lot of times when you see the vitriol coming at it, it's hard to sometimes distinguish between those who are against Disney because they want Legends back, or those who are against Disney for anti-Disney reasons, versus those who are against Disney who leans left because they are on the right or the alt-right in the far cases. So, for instance, you know, when people go after Kelly Marie Tran, they may be going after, I mean, they shouldn't be, but say they're going after Kelly Marie Tran and they feel like they have a reason to do so. You might have somebody who, like, hates Rose or hates The Last Jedi going after Kelly Marie Tran. That does not make them necessarily alt-right, because maybe they don't care about race or anything. They just didn't like the character of the film, think it's demeaning to Star Wars and blah, 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 and they're attacking Kelly Marie Tran. Whereas you would also have the people out there, like a certain collecting website, doing reviews where they're going into basically the race angle, and essentially going after Rose as the Asian character, and how dare they, etc., right? You know, where's another male character? Where's another white character? Oh, here's the token Asian character, etc., etc. So, I mean, it's all kind of coming at Disney at the same time. And it's all coming at Star Wars at the same time. doesn't mean it's come from the same place. Doesn't mean that those two are connected. I would say that think of alt legends and alt-right as a Venn diagram. You got your one circle for one, your one circle for the other. There's a slight overlap in the middle where alt legends and alt-right do indeed come together. But that's certainly not the majority of it. Though I would say that there's probably, you probably don't see a lot of people who are alt-right jumping on the bandwagon of alt-legends, specifically with the whole Legends thing, so much as maybe jumping in on an anti-Disney bandwagon. Like, if somebody's just on the alt-right and they're using Star Wars as their battlefield, I don't think they give a shit about Jason Solo, Jaina Solo, Kyle Katarn. They probably couldn't care less about Legends. They may not even know what the hell Legends is. So branding them alt-legends, the extreme of that faction, doesn't seem right either. But I do agree that there are people who are hijacking Star Wars and sort of using that. But there are also people who legitimately are Star Wars fans who are in the extreme, either as alt-right or alt-legends or both, as the case may be. And part of that, I think, comes down to, and this goes back to the Kelly Marie Tran thing, we somehow in society have broken our brains, and a huge number of people out there can't figure out how the hell to tell the difference between a character and the actor that plays them. Or recognize the difference between the role of, say, a director and a writer and a producer versus an actor, right? If you want to bitch about the politics of The Last Jedi, or the politics of Disney lately, or the diversity of whatever, or you didn't like The Last Jedi and you want to attack The Last Jedi, I mean, the people that you're bitching about are like Rian Johnson and Kathleen Kennedy, right? If it's The Force Awakens, J.J. Abrams, and so on. If it's Solo, it's the Kasdans. Why are you attacking someone who was paid to play a role that was written by someone else about which they had little control other than how they performed what was written for them, right? People like to bring up well, Luke Skywalker was such a crappy character, even Mark Hamill hated the way it was handled. But go back and look at some of the stuff Mark Hamill has said. He said he didn't agree with the way that Luke was being portrayed because he had a very different view of how Luke should act. But as an actor, it was his job to do the best he could with what he was given, and in the end, he found it to be a good film, just not what he necessarily expected to be doing. That's an actor's job. Here is your role. Here are the lines. Perform it. That's it, right? Kelly Marie Tran didn't create Rose. She played as Rose. She performed the part. She didn't create Rose. Why go after her because you didn't like the way the character was written? Why go after the cast and crew of Rogue One because of the diversity? I mean, it wasn't like, what's somebody's name out of there that I could use? It wasn't like Diego Luna sat back and said, I think for this role, I'm going to not be a white man. That's the ticket. I'm not going to... Yeah, because he had control over that shit, right? He didn't control the casting. He went out for the part, liked the part, got the part, performed the part. Someone else decided what the cast racial and diversity makeup was going to look like, how the characters would be written. None of that is in the actor's hands. And yet somehow, because they're the face of the character, they get all the shit, right? I mean, if you go to Mark Hamill and you're like, wow, I really love the Force and stuff that you created. And no, I mean, that's Lucas, right? Lucas is the guy behind creating the Force and all of the philosophy behind it. If we're talking about the original trilogy, Mark just portrayed Luke as the character. We have to be able to separate those out. Otherwise, we're going to be going after actors and actresses and trying to put them in jail or threatening them because they played fucking terrorists on TV. And that's asinine. Or you'll have a person on TV who abuses another character, abuses a child or something, and then for the rest of their life, they're a child abuser in real life in terms of the stigma on them. We've got to separate reality from fiction, and even when we're looking at fiction, we've got to be able to separate the different roles played in the creative process versus who actually gets to make the creative decisions. It's generally not the actors and actresses. And this is not something that's new. We just found out here recently, and I'm not at all surprised, that after the Phantom Menace and the backlash against Jar Jar, Ahmed Best considered suicide because of all the crap that he was getting. And this is 99 in the early 2000s we're talking about here. This isn't even the social media age at that point. So we got to be able to draw that distinction, and unfortunately most people do not, which is just idiotic. I do sort of agree with the comment about the comparison to ISIS in the context in which it was said. Now, obviously, we don't want to compare asshole fans harassing fans with terrorists, okay? Unless they are using fear to actually do something, but that depends on whether you're defining terrorism as a method or terrorism in the broader geopolitical sense. But yeah, the idea that there are plenty of people out there who will see something go wrong or see something happen that fits their agenda and go out and then claim responsibility for it, oh, absolutely, we'll see stuff like that. Do I have any doubt that the people claiming that they harassed Kelly Marie Tran actually did so? Probably not, because it kind of takes an asshole to not only do it, but also to be proud of doing it, or to take credit for doing it. But were the people who actually were taking credit the ones who finally were the last straw that caused her to leave Instagram? Maybe, maybe not. But does it really matter in the grand scheme of things whether they actually are to be credited with that? The fact that they are wanting to take credit pretty much makes them assholes. You've already got your sign. But it's stuff like that why you have these movements out there. And I tend to be someone who doesn't like the idea of joining just about any movement. I'm very DJ, I guess, in that sense, except I'm not a jerk that's going to betray people. But the idea of don't join. Right? His don't join is because it's all a machine, man, and all that. My don't join is pretty simple. When you stand behind a particular cause and join a particular group, when you're not just out there espousing a certain view, you're actually joining a group that espouses a view, you essentially are putting yourself in the position where you can be held responsible, or you are expected to be responsible to some degree for the actions of others of that group, particularly the leadership. Even if there's a point where I vote, say, Democrat or Republican, and I've voted for both, I would not call myself a Democrat or Republican, because I'm not going to be sitting here painted with the same brush as a Trump, an Obama, a Bush, a Clinton, on back, right? Because you sort of wind up getting labeled by the party, and anything that that party does falls back on you to some degree when someone realizes, oh, you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, you're a whatever. Same thing in this case. There are movements specifically against this type of harassment. But typically, I'm not going to jump into that and actually start using their hashtags and stuff like that, because sometimes I'll know well enough that I don't necessarily agree with everything that the leaders of that particular movement believe. Sometimes I don't know enough about what those people believe to be willing to put myself on the line for what they believe. But you don't have to necessarily be part of a movement to be out there speaking out against toxic fandom, speaking out against harassers, speaking out for civility. That shouldn't be a movement. That should be normal, everyday life, right? The norm should be civility. The norm should be trying to do right by each other. The norm should be not harassing. The norm should be not treating other fans like garbage. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to necessarily be the norm, at least among the vocal groups out there. But I think still among most Star Wars fans, that is the norm. We love Star Wars. We don't care what form it takes. If you love Star Wars 2, come join in our reindeer games. Everything else is just noise, in essence. That said, there has been some talk, some call of how, if you have a podcast that's out there and they're speaking, and it sort of seems like they're cultivating the alt-right as part of the audience. And again, full disclosure, haven't listened to Rebel Force Radio. I only listened to a tiny bit of their day as the Forcecast and such. Just has never been my particular cup of tea for various reasons, both in terms of content and some of the reactions and relations that they've had with other members of the podcasting community, which for a long time was very tight-knit, so you kind of know the dirty laundry going around it sometimes. So for multiple reasons, I've never bothered to listen, don't care to listen. But that also means that I can't really venture forth an opinion on what was said because I didn't hear it. I haven't read it. And if I did hear it or read it, I would need context for it. But let's assume that, sure, this is a group that's trying to cultivate the alt-right as part of their audience, or that anyone is. I am of a mind to say the opposite of what some fans are saying, which is they should just shut up and they just should not be able to podcast because they're playing into base instincts of a particular part of society, blah, blah, blah. I tend to be someone who leans, again, little L libertarian, classical liberal to some degree, which is basically, I tend to lean on the side of freedom, which includes free speech, includes freedom of the press. Say what you want to say, right? The whole reason why we have free speech is not to protect the speech that we like, is to protect the speech that we find abhorrent. That's the whole point. You don't have to protect speech you like. Nobody's trying to shut it down. It's the speech you find abhorrent that you have to actually protect through process of law, due process, and so forth. And generally speaking, from a historical perspective, it's usually a lot better to allow a venting than a growth in secret, so to speak. So I would much rather, for instance, have a podcast espousing alt-right views, or have the KKK having a rally in town, as was the case with white supremacists down in Noonan, Georgia, where my wife actually works, which is like 10, 20 minutes down I-85 from here, and that includes the time to get onto I-85. I would rather have, the racists, the bigots, the homophobes, those types of people. I would rather have those people out expressing themselves for a number of reasons. One, because generally when they're not given an outlet like that, if you have people who are festering in hate and they're doing so in silence, kind of in the dark places of society, that's where violence breeds. And there's a big difference between saying a bunch of hurtful shit and actually instigating or calling for violence. Hurt my feelings all you like. Don't hurt people physically, right? So sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me kind of thing as applied to political speech. And along the same lines, generally, if the people are speaking out, you know who it is, right? If someone is out in public and it happens to be the guy that runs like the barbershop down the street and they're out there espousing all kinds of racist stuff, then you, as another member of society, can say, oh, I didn't realize he was an asshole, but he is. I'm going to get my hair cut somewhere else, right? One of the things our society thrives on is this idea that whether it's a good idea, bad idea, abhorrent, or beloved, ideas are supposed to fight on that battlefield of ideas. You convince each other of the rightness or wrongness of your ideas. You try to persuade. And in the process of it, those ideas and those who are espousing them come to light and allow you to have that type of sort of culture war, so to speak, but make it a war of words and ideas, not of physical violence. I would much rather have a podcast out there if they are holding bigoted views, spewing it on their podcast, because then we know what kind of people they are, and we can just not subscribe. And eventually, if enough people say, screw it, they're not subscribing, maybe they're going to be podcasting to themselves, or maybe they just stop, right? You don't have to actively shut someone down if you have victory within the war of ideas, so to speak. And I know that's more of an idealistic thing than many would say, we need a pragmatic, practical response. But in the big picture, in sort of the course of history, it's the war of ideas on the battlefield of ideas that truly makes for the changes that will make society better and sort of cleanse a lot of those dark places. Light of discussion being sort of the disinfectant of those types of things. I mean, I think back to the civil rights movement. It wasn't the violence of the civil rights movement that worked. It was the words and it was the ideas and it was the changing hearts and minds. You're not going to change the mind of someone on the alt-right or anyone else who has a sincerely held belief, no matter how abhorrent we may find it. You're not going to change their mind by shutting them up. You're not going to change their mind by saying, well, screw you, I'm not going to buy from you. It's not going to change their ideas. You may be able to influence behavior, perhaps, but chances are you're not going to change their minds. Force, whether it's force of law, force of societal pressure, violence, usually doesn't wind up working that way. You can try to show people the wrong-headedness of their ideas, but just trying to say, well, because I don't like your idea, shut up, it's not going to change anyone's mind. It's not going to change anyone's behavior most of the time. So yeah. So if someone's out there and they've got some ideas that we find abhorrent, let them speak. It shines a light on who's doing the speaking. We can choose whether or not to interact with them well. It keeps the violence or the hate from festering in the darkness, and it allows for a battle of ideas in which, generally speaking, the right side tends to come out most of the time on top. And that's kind of the ball game to me, right? It's that long-term good. Shutting down, a podcast you disagree with or something like that may wind up doing some short-term good of, oh, well, these people aren't going to be offended anymore because the people that were offending them have shut up. It's not going to do a long-term good in terms of that set of ideas, in terms of those individuals. It's going to have to be something more idea-based than an action, in essence. But again, that's just me. That's kind of the idealist in me. But then again, I do teach, government economics and history and all that kind of stuff, including American history and founding principles as a teacher. So I'm kind of seeped in this stuff, and that's where my ideology myself tends to come from. So yeah, should they be able to hold whatever opinions they like if they want? Sure. Should they be able to espouse them? Sure. We don't have to listen. We don't have to agree. But part of a free society is that, yes, even that stuff out there that is disagreeable gets aired, because in the end, it's better than some of the consequences if it's not, at least from this history teacher's perspective. All right, so with that, we'll wrap up this somewhat more in-depth, I suppose, Q&A for this month. Again, if you would like to ask a question for next month, make sure you go to the Patreon, patreon.com/NathanPButler. Go to the question collection thread that's labeled as July 2018. Put in your questions. That's because it's being collected in July. And then I'll use that for the August Q&A. My thanks to David Ray for the question. I really appreciate it, and I will catch you next time. Until then, may the force be with you, and thank you again for your support on Patreon.